Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Kevin Becker from Texas Women's University. A look at focus of attention strategies and cueing in sports. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I had a great discussion with Kevin Becker about his work looking at focus of attention and cueing in sports performance. We discussed topics including what factors moderate the classic external focus is better than an internal focus effect, what are athletes' self-reported focus strategies, how might we use multiple cues or holistic cues, and how does visual impairment change the effect of attentional focus? So today my guest is Kevin Becker from Texas Women's University. Thanks for taking some time to join me, Kevin.
Yeah, happy to do so, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
To start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in motor learning and performance kind of research?
Sure. Yeah, I think my background is similar to a lot of people in the field where my own sporting experience is really what led to a lot of my interest. And so I competed in track and field primarily in the hammer throw events. And my first year out of college was lucky to qualify for the 2008 Olympic trials. And so my own sporting experience drove a lot of my interest. And then when I got started into my graduate study, I originally went to get my master's degree just because I wanted to get into college track and field coaching. Mm-hmm. And so I went for a master's in sports psychology. But my first semester there, I had a class in motor learning and performance. And I remember getting to attentional focus. And I mean, my advisor, who ended up being my advisor there, gave us about 7 or 8 different papers to read. And coming from a kind of coaching background and athletics background, I was reading these papers and thinking, how in the world does this make sense? Everything we do is internally focused. I just don't buy this. And so I read those papers. We went through the class discussion, and then I kind of continued reading everything I could find on the topic and started working with my advisor there, Pete Smith. And in a pretty short time, we ended up running 3 studies that were just kind of focused on not believing that the external focus benefit worked. And, so clearly I didn't change the world and show that an internal focus is better than an external focus. But it was really interesting, and I prior to that had no interest really in going into research, but really got addicted to it and loved it. So I went on for a PhD at the University of Tennessee, working with Jeff Fairbrother, and then since graduating there, I've been at Texas Women's University for 6 years now, with my main research line in motor learning and performance, primarily with attentional focus still.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And yeah, I think that's a pretty common thing you find with coaches, kind of the mismatch between the research. I think it's changing a bit, but the mismatch between what coaches do and the research tells you in terms of external and internal. And so can you tell us a little bit about kind of those studies you do? You know, what it seems, we're looking at your research, it seems like what you maybe have found is things that kind of moderate this effect. Like maybe it's not as clean cut as sometimes we portray this internal versus external.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say kind of a general theme of the stuff I've tried to focus on is trying to go beyond just the internal external dichotomy and understand a little bit more about recognizing that in things like sport performance, and I'm sure other fields like rehabilitation, our attentional focus is a little more complex than that. And so some of the early stuff I did looking at different moderators. What ended up being my master's thesis, actually, with Pete Smith, was we looked at moderators like task complexity, we had age, like comparing children and adults. We had looked at gender as a factor. But it was just kind of this big thing, and this one was really Pete's brainchild. But just looking at what are factors that influence this, we had some previous studies that show task complexity seems to influence the effect, and so that one we found again kind of the task complexity thing. We found kind of an odd finding with differences due to gender, and at the end it was kind of a crazy study with having so many different conditions. I think we had 96 participants, but still with 12 per group, it was kind of hard to understand what was going on. So the gender thing in particular, I don't think there's anything inherent about being a male or female that makes attentional focus impact you differently, but there's probably something more going on there about how those participants maybe approach the task that might have changed whether they benefited from an external focus or not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So with complexity, did you find with greater complexity the internal became more effective, or?
No. So with greater complexity, we found the external focus benefit. With a more simple version of the task, we found no differences at all due to attentional focus. Okay. So the task we were using was riding a pedalo device over a 7-meter distance, and so you're standing with your feet on 2 different platforms and moving them forward, almost like an elliptical. But we had one version of the task that had very big platforms and also had handles for you to hold on to. And that was our simple version of the task. And then the complex version was smaller pedals on the device with no handles. So more of a dynamic balance component to the task.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because I know there's a little bit of a thread in the research. If you look, there's some studies finding that, and the idea that internal is better for novices and external is better as you get more skilled. I don't know if that kind of relates to complexity or anything that you found.
I think it could. In that study, we didn't find an internal benefit. I think one way I've thought about this over the years, especially looking at some of the balancing studies that are out there, I think when a task is just so easy that you don't really need to invest much in your performance, for one, you kind of question, do people actually stay focused on the focus cue that you've given them if it's 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute, or 90 seconds long? And then the other thing is, do you stay engaged with that cue, and does it really influence your performance if you can perform it fairly automatically? So I think what we had going on was a little bit more on that side, where the task was just so easy that you can just kind of do it without really thinking about it much. But yeah, I think there are some interesting things in the studies that show a potential internal focus benefit in the novice population. We've not, thinking back to my knowledge, I don't think I've replicated that benefit of an internal focus in any of the studies that I've done at this point. It's still an interesting thing that needs some more exploration and understanding, beyond just internal, external, what's maybe different about these cues that might help a novice compared to an expert.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think I like what you've done. I've often said that it's time to kind of move on from the basic internal versus external for task X study and get into more like that's, unless you have a reason to predict a different result than's been found 100 times now, getting into the more subtleties. And I know I know you've done where you've looked at using multiple different cues kind of in an additive way. Can you talk a little bit about what you've done there?
Yeah. So in that study, what we did, we developed a set of 3 internal focus cues and a set of 3 external focus cues that were functionally equivalent or similar, just differing based on if they directed attention internally or externally. And so what we were really interested in there is, a criticism you could make of some attentional focus research, or really a lot of it, is that we tend to compare the effectiveness of one cue to the effectiveness of another cue. And so in some studies, the internally focused cues that we would use, a coach might look at them and say, that's a cue I would never use. I would never tell somebody to focus just on extending their knee quickly in a jumping task. I might tell them something like focus on an explosive movement with your legs or something like that. And so it kind of gets to this point of it, could some of the findings, some of the decrements of an internal focus, could it be just that we're using ineffective cues? And so what we wanted to try was giving them a few different cues, and then kind of based on some of the self-control literature that Jeff Fairbrother had done in his background, we decided to then give the participants the option to choose how they wanted to use those cues. So we had, again, 3 external and 3 internal cues. So they were assigned to one focus type, but then throughout the practice or throughout the acquisition phase, they were allowed to select whichever cue they wanted for each block. So we had blocks of, I think, 5 or 6 throws, if I remember right, in a dart throwing task. And then we asked them to stick with the same cue for each block, but between blocks, then they were free to choose how they wanted. And so it was kind of a small step in trying to get a little bit closer to what might happen in a coaching environment, where often you're cycling through multiple cues as a coach, trying to find something that works for each individual athlete. And so what we found in that study was similar to the traditional finding. We found a benefit of an external focus relative to an internal focus. And what was interesting is some of the comparisons within that, though, was, our cues were things like on the external focus side, to focus on hitting the target, to focus on having a straight dart path. Mm-hmm. And so looking kind of at the functions of what needs to happen in a dart throw and looking at different task components. And so we did a post-hoc comparison to see were certain cues more effective when people used them. And in that study, we didn't find any evidence of that. But it was, I think in a small way, it gives us a little bit more of a clue where if you can think about your kind of cue set as a coach, if there's a way to develop cues that you're using right now that might be internally focused into an external focus cue and still have it be relevant to what you're trying to accomplish, then maybe that's an effective way of doing it. So it's not ever that we're trying to get to using one single cue. That's not going to be effective in a practical environment. But if we can kind of reframe the cues that we are using to fit less of a conscious control on what your body is doing, maybe that helps us out a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think, I know in my research, I look back and I agree with you. Some of the cues are just, as a researcher, you just make them up, focus on your hand, Yeah. You're right. They're something a coach would never, ever do. Or also the point I make sometimes is good coach individualizes cues, right? They don't give the same to all the people in the group like we have to, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my background in the throwing events in track and field, it's very much a mindset of finding the cue that gives the effect that you're looking for. And it's kind of an interesting process because it's, as I've talked with other throwers and observed and coached, it's kind of this idea of looking for the cue, and then that cue is going to work for a while, and then that kind of stops working, and then you're looking for the next cue. And so I think especially in a sport like that where people are, it's a discrete skill, self-paced task. People are going in oftentimes with a deliberate focus plan, or what do I want to think about on this throw? I think it's important to kind of understand the structure of when you are going to individualize those, how should they be structured and how can we make them work the best? Yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. And I think the choice is a really interesting one, and how cues build on each other, right? I think, especially when you're looking at it for a learning mechanism, I think that's interesting to me. I know another thing that you've looked at, I've seen, is the holistic cues. Can you talk a little bit what you mean by that and how you've used that?
Yeah, sure. So this idea kind of first came when I was at Tennessee. I was lucky to spend some time with Craig Risberg, and he transitioned later in his career primarily to applied sports psychology, working with athletes. And one of the things I talked with him a lot about was this idea of coming up with a cue and some of the cues that he had used with his different athletes and how that fit with attentional focus literature. And the idea that emerged in those conversations was always this idea of, he talked a lot of times about his approach to applied sports psychology consulting was grounded in existential phenomenology. And so he'd go in with these really open-ended questions and just follow them where they went. And so one strategy he talked about for finding a focus cue with athletes was just asking them, think about when you're swimming really well, what's that like? And just that really basic open, what's that like? And often it comes up with this idea of, well, it feels like this, or I can feel when I'm swimming really well, it's like one of the cues that he's published in a paper somewhere is, he had a swimmer he worked with that used the cue of easy speed. And that just reminded him of this big idea of when he was swimming well, it always felt really easy, and it felt like he was going really fast without this high effort. And so from that, we kind of started framing this idea of, what about a very broad cue that kind of cues you to the general feeling or sensation of what that's like. And then where we came up with the term holistic was actually from some work by Richard Mullen and Lou Hardy, looking at the difference in holistic goals and part process goals. And so that's where we initially ended up framing that term. And then, so the first study we did in that area was using the standing long jump paradigm in attentional focus, comparing within participants an internal focus, external focus, and then we added a holistic focus cue. And so again, we defined a holistic focus as a focus on the general feeling of the movement. And so the cue we used in a standing long jump was just to focus on feeling explosive. And then we compared that to the traditional internal and external focus cues of, I think in that one, we asked them not specifically to the knee, but to focus on rapidly extending your legs on a standing long jump. And then our external cue was focused on jumping toward a cone that was out in the distance. And we chose that task because that produces very consistent results between an internal and external focus. We really weren't sure what to expect with the holistic focus, but it turned out that holistic focus and an external focus produced really similar jump distance, and both were farther than an internal focus and a baseline.
That's really interesting. And so would you say a holistic cue is a bit different than using an analogy?
And that's something I've kind of continued to kind of conceptualize is where does a holistic focus fit into a broader model of attentional focus? And I think there are some similarities with an analogy. I think there are some similarities with the use of imagery, because you're kind of imagining this sensation occurring. I don't know that it cleanly fits into either category, I guess.
Yeah. To me, there's also an element of I've read that I would encourage everyone to read that Hardy and Mullen paper, that too. That's a really good study in your work. To me, there's a kind of an element of order too. A lot of the cues we use we're talking about position or velocity, whereas a holistic cue, I think, is trying to get at like a higher order, like smoothness, you know what I mean? Of description, as opposed to these lower order variables. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of I think there's, I've read some things a while back. Bernstein has some things talking about kind of level of control. I know there's a paper by Robin Valacher that Gabby cites in one of her review papers that talks about kind of this hierarchical level of control. And so I think what's interesting about a holistic focus is you're really engaged in the performance of the task. It's not taking your attention away from what you're doing, but it's doing it in a way where you're not focused on the control of the movement. The movement is organizing more automatically, I think, and you're experiencing, or you're focused on the sensation of what that feels like when you do it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I let another one, when people talk about rhythm, I think is another kind of thing that fits in with that. And I think I like that because one of the challenges, I think, with the traditional external, if you just get someone to focus on the movement effect, right? Mm-hmm. So what do they do before the effect happens, right? Yeah. You're not giving them anything you have to essentially not pay attention to your movement for a while and then focus on the effect of it. 'Cause there's this kind of temporal relationship I think we haven't quite dug into enough yet.
Yeah, I agree. And what that kind of makes me think about is some of the stuff that's gone on with the discussion of the distance effect in attentional focus. And it's when we look at the distance effect, it's the initial papers, it was as simple as on a stabiliometer, how far away were the markers on the platform from your feet. And so there you're specifically manipulating the distance. But I think in a lot of the later stuff, we're looking at things like the golf papers, like Bell and Hardy's paper. Yeah, it is a distal focus to focus on where the ball is going. And that's different from focusing on the club face, which is more proximal. But it does kind of get this idea of the other thing that's different about those is one is an end outcome that happens after you've performed the skill. And the other one still has some kind of online monitoring of what you're doing. So you're not focused on what your body's doing, but you're still focused in the moment on kind of the control of the movement. So I think that's another way there's some differences there. And I know Harjeev Singh and Gabby just published another paper looking at a similar manipulation in, I think it was a volleyball pass, if I remember right. And they were comparing either hitting toward a target that was on the floor or a focus on the platform. It's what they called the platform. They described it as an external proximal focus. I think some people might disagree whether that's an internal or an external focus, since the platform really is your arms. But if you get away from the internal-external comparison, it really is a difference of focusing on an end outcome or focusing on something about the process of what you're doing. that's an interesting thing that needs a little deeper understanding of how we're comparing that. Is it just the distance, or is it something more about this end outcome versus kind of controlling the process of something?
Yeah. And that's where I think, I like the holistic. It seems to capture both. It keeps you're capturing kind of the relationship of your movement to the actual environment, not just, so I think that's a really interesting approach. But yeah, there are these kind of subtleties. You're right. I think we need to dig in more. I know I wanted to ask you, maybe this goes back to something we talked about right at the start. I know you've looked at kind of what athletes report they use as well, digging, which is, I think, a really interesting thing to see both how is this message getting out there to this external focus message, and does it align with what people are actually doing? And what kind of things have you found there?
Yeah, so I think that this part is pretty important to me. I think it's kind of it's got to be a back and forth. So when we look at, people talk all the time about the theory to practice approach, and that approach would be starting with laboratory experiments and then trying to apply them to more applied scenarios. But I think it's just as important to be out and see what are high performers actually doing, and then try to make sense of how that fits in with what we think we know about how you would control or learn or perform movements. And so I had a doctoral student a few years ago who was interested in, she was a softball coach actually. And so she was interested in attentional focus and batting. And so we developed a kind of a survey project where we had some Likert type questions that were related to kind of the types of attentional focus that have been studied in our experimental literature. So we categorized kind of a couple different types of an external focus, because we recognize within batting and baseball or softball, external covers a kind of a huge spectrum of things. It could be the target of where you're trying to get the ball to land. It could be just a focus on the ball that's coming at you, making contact with the bat, the movement of the bat. And so we kind of try to separate that into two distinct categories of things about kind of the end outcome and things about more of the implement, the handling of the implement. And then we had some questions representing, of course, an internal focus, and a few questions about a holistic focus. And then we also included both the idea of analogies and distraction in there. And so we had a few questions related to each of those 5 types of focus, and then asked them to score on a Likert scale how likely are you to use these when you're batting? And we focused not on practice, but we focused on just the performance element in a game. And so they scored those. And on the Likert side of things, what we generally found was that external outcome was what people rated the highest across the board. And I think generally a lot of that came from, there were some questions about tracking the ball, basically. And so I don't think any batter is going to tell you that they don't focus on tracking the ball to try to hit it. So that was one of the findings. But then we did also find in that study that we did a split based on batting average. And I can't remember exactly what cutoff we used, but we tried to use a cutoff that was kind of representative of a high level performer in batting. The only difference we found in the skill level comparison, I guess, was that the higher skilled batters were more likely to report using a holistic focus. That happened kind of around the same time we were first starting these experimental studies with the holistic focus. And so that was kind of interesting to us. And we also had some kind of open-ended questions that just asked, what do you focus on? And one question was just, what are the primary things that you focus on while you're batting? And then we had a second one that was, what are the things that your coach tells you to focus on while you're batting? And so as you can guess, this probably weren't completely congruent. The kind of interesting things were that there was a gap, there was a difference, there was a lot more what you might call kind of include internal and external together, a lot more technical elements coming from the coach. And the athletes, the majority of their focus were things like just tracking the ball, making contact, see the ball, hit the ball, kind of themes like that coming out. And so with that, it was kind of interesting. The first reason we were interested in looking at batting was that the student I was working with was a softball coach. But beyond that, it was kind of interesting because some of the early papers that used either survey approach or interview approaches with skilled athletes, we see that they almost never use an external focus, or there's a really high prevalence of internally focused language that they report using. And so we're thinking, the act of hitting in baseball or softball, inherently it should make a lot of sense to use an external focus, where something like figure skating, it's maybe a little bit more abstract. You don't have an implement. You're not trying to get to a specific target. And so figuring out how to fit an external focus into a sport like that maybe doesn't work quite as well. And so that was where our approach was on that. More recently, I've got a collaboration going right now with Chris Aiken and one of his doctoral students, where Chris and his student actually traveled to the USA Track and Field Indoor Championships, and following the throwing competitions, they interviewed a number of throwers there. And what kind of wrinkle we tried to add with that study was we tried to focus on the kind of the temporal pattern of when you're focusing on certain things. So we try to divide up kind of the time where you're approaching the ring before you enter the ring to throw. What are you thinking about while you're in the ring during the actual throw? What are you thinking about? And then kind of an immediate reflection afterward too. And so we're still in the process of going through that data. They collected that data right at the end of February before all sporting events in the world ended. So the most interesting thing we're kind of wanting to get out of that is this temporal pattern of when are you focused on different things? Because it's, when we think about the experimental literature, usually what we're telling people to do is just focus on this cue the whole time. And so we've done one experimental study where we looked at comparison and preparation for and execution of the task. So where we gave them one cue during the preparation while they're getting ready to perform the task, and then directed them to think about a different cue while they were executing, and comparing internal or external. So with this study with track and field throwers, we're just trying to get a better idea of what are you doing as you're preparing, what are you focusing on while you're actually executing, and then immediately after, what's kind of the reflection there.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I really look forward to seeing that. I've thought that for a while. I've also thought that, kind of with relevance to the choking literature, sometimes when you just ask an athlete, what do you focus on or what do you think about? You really need to say when, right?
Exactly.
Are you talking about between at bats? Are you talking about right? Like I know Nick Winkelman also emphasizes this too. Like what cueing, we're talking about the last thing you get in your head before you move, not what you're doing between when you're trying to tweak things or make adjustments. Like, there's different times for different things. So I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, there's even this question of during the actual execution, are you necessarily really focused on anything? I mean, when we think about how people describe the flow experience and when they're really at peak performance with low effort, I think a lot of times there is this experience of, it's not like you're blacking out, but I don't think you're consciously focused on anything. And so I think peeling that timing thing apart is really important, because there may be times where during the execution, it is important to be focused on something, but there may be times where immediately prior to the performance, maybe there's one particular thing that you want to cue yourself to, but then once you actually enter the actual execution, maybe that's not there. I mean, in different tasks, there might be different attentional demands. Maybe you want to, during the execution, free up your attentional focus to be able to, pick up relevant things that you need to for the performance of the task, as opposed to trying to kind of be consciously focused on this cue that we've developed.
Another kind of area I wanted to ask you about, I know people have started to expand the focus of attention ideas beyond sports into kind of rehab and other things. And you've done some of that with special populations. You've done work with people with visual impairment.
So this ended up kind of it's one of those things that just happened because the right things aligned. So we have at Texas Women's University, we have a very strong tradition in adapted physical education, and we host a visual impairment sports camp every summer on our campus. And so I talked with some of the people. Once I learned about that just kind of came into my mind, and I thought, that's kind of an interesting idea. I wonder if we get in and do some research with these people while they're here. And so then I think it was about my third or fourth year here, we had a doctoral student who was really interested in visual impairment. And so I got him involved, and we did our initial study on campus here with kids who were at this sports camp. And we just compared balancing on a stabilizometer with an internal or an external focus. And then we had the people in the camp were a pretty wide spectrum of the severity of visual impairment. And so we ended up in looking at visual acuity scores. And then there's also a sport classification that gives 4 levels, B1 through B4. I can't remember the exact criteria for those, but what we ended up doing was we ended up dividing people into more severe visual impairments, people that are generally either completely blind or very, very low vision, generally walking with a cane. And then we had our group of moderate visual impairment, people who had less impairment. And so what we again, looked at there as just a really simple, quick study since it was in the middle of their sport camp where we had them come in and balance on the stabilometer under each of those two conditions. What we found was that with people with moderate visual impairment, they had the traditional external focus benefit compared to internal focus. With the severe visual impairment, we had a pretty small number. We only had 7 people, and they showed no statistical difference, but there was kind of a trend in the direction of a benefit of an internal focus. And so that was pretty interesting to us. Just thinking about, when we think about our way external focus cues are usually structured, in some tasks, it's really about kind of the planning of the movement. In something like balancing in the stabilometer, you're cued to basically continually monitor either the position of your feet or the position of the platform underneath you. And so we were kind of curious in that population where vision is very impaired, or there perhaps is no vision, would it be really difficult for them to use an external focus cue just because they really have no frame of reference of what the platform is doing. And so again, in that initial study, we didn't really have a large enough sample to make a strong conclusion on those people. We were able to do a second series of studies where we traveled down to a school for the blind and visually impaired and got a larger sample of people. And so one of the second paper we have published was using a task that kind of replicates a skill in the disability sport of goalball, or visual impaired sport of goalball. Mm-hmm. And so what we had them doing basically was just rolling a ball for maximum velocity. We wanted them to roll the ball as fast as they could. And we had them, you can use either an internal or an external focus within participant comparison. In that group, in a group with severe visual impairment, we found again a benefit of an external focus over an internal focus in that ball rolling task. We also, while we were down there, collected another data set with a stabilometer task, and we're still working on that one. And initially, the results really just aren't very clear. I think in our goal in going to this school was to get a more homogeneous sample in terms of visual impairment. But I think in working with any population with disabilities, you recognize that there's so much inherent variability from person to person. I think it's a difficult population to study, especially if you're looking at a comparison. So we're still working through that data. We don't really have a very solid answer at this point.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting stuff, though. I think that's it makes me think of it's kind of another complication to the external is this. So the traditional explanation of external benefit is, the constrained action hypothesis. You're mm-hmm. preventing disruption of automaticity, but like you mentioned, you're also changing the information you get, right?
Sure.
When you focus on the outcome, you're getting different information than if you focus on your feet, right? Yeah. I know there's been some studies that have tried to tease that apart, but I think that's a really interesting one, and that different people might benefit. I think it's also important to look into. The last study I wanted to ask you about yours is I saw you have a very new one just come out on looking at entropy, which is getting into really the kind of obviously something I'm really interested in, kind of variability issues and things like that. Can you tell us about that study?
Yeah, so this one, not too different from the visual impairment stuff. It was kind of an opportunity presented itself. So I have a doctoral student, Chung-Ru Hung is his name. He started as a biomechanics PhD student and was developed an interest in motor behavior, and so started working with me. And so with his background in motion capture and biomechanics, we decided to pursue something in the realm of movement variability and attentional focus. So in that initial study, it was a fairly simple design, just using the stabilometer task within participant design, and then looking at both just the traditional standard deviation of the platform angle throughout the trials, and then also looking at the sample entropy. So in that study, what we found was that with an external focus, people had higher levels of sample entropy than an internal focus, and I believe it was also higher than baseline. I should remember that, but I'm kind of drawing a blank on there now. So we've had a couple of studies since then. But it was kind of interesting, and we had done that just after Chris Ray and Louisa Raisbeck and Jed Diekvis had published a similar study with quiet standing, mm-hmm. Looking at the sample entropy in terms of postural control there, and so it was kind of an initial interesting thing for me. For me, it was something new to dig into, learning more about sample entropy. And I pretty quickly learned it's not something that's as simple as higher is better, lower is worse, but it's kind of a complex thing. But it was, I don't know, to me, it was interesting to understand a little bit more about the structure of the variability, where some of the previous stuff we had, I think Keith Loesch has a couple papers looking at like the magnitude of variability within joint angles in a dart throwing task. But so it was kind of an opportunity that presented itself that I think hopefully provides a little bit more understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, kind of the interpretation of it. I know so entropy is, I always think it's basically predictability, right?
Yeah.
Which you're right. Sometimes it's good in behavior, but the example I always think of is like heart rate variability.
Yeah.
Like having something that's too predictable and regular, like a metronome, is not actually very good. It's a sign of a very dangerous health condition. So I don't know. What is balance? Because is there a simple story with entropy and balance?
It doesn't really seem to be. It's kind of one of those things where there are papers showing this, there are papers showing that. I think one of the things that we looked at was that showing that, trying to recall now, there's a study out there. It's actually cited in our paper. I have to look back to see who the authors were. But looking in terms of fall prevention, looking at strategies to increase. There's some evidence out there that strategies that can increase entropy, especially in people with fall risk, can present some benefit. And there's some ideas that some training strategies can increase entropy over time. And so there could be a potential benefit for postural control. I'm not an expert in postural control, so I don't feel like I can give a really strong statement on that, but it was it's kind of interesting. And the more I read about it, it's kind of one of those things that I think there's still a lot more questions to be answered and understanding. And one of the suggestions we made is looking at this in terms of a training protocol. Especially if we're looking at a novel balancing task, if somebody improves their performance over time, we would see clearly reduction in like the standard deviation of something like an angle platform, or maybe the standard deviation of center pressure trace in a different type of task. Over time, how does something like sample entropy change in a paradigm like that? And how is that then influenced by attentional focus? So I think there's still some questions to be answered in that area.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you're right. It's just the idea that not all variability is created equal. It's maybe it's something like a U-shaped kind of pattern where you need a certain amount of variability to be adaptable, but you want to be stable and adaptable at the same time, kind of like.
Yeah, I think that's that's a good. I'd say that's a good way of putting it. A good conclusion that a couple of authors have mentioned is that too high is not good, too low is not good. But the adaptable place in the middle probably is the place to be. And so, in terms of when we like in this study where we saw an increase or a higher level in an external focus, it's probably the question becomes, I guess, how do you know if that means you're getting to more optimal level, or if you're getting to a place that's not optimal? I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. It has such a strong influence, the focus, attentional focus. So the very last thing I wanted to ask you is, you talked a little bit about some of the studies you're expanding on, and I want to ask you kind of what you're working on next, what's going on now and in the future, if we're allowed to do research again, and what do you have planned?
Well, so part of it in the immediate, one thing we have planned is we're kind of expanding what we're looking at with some survey research in terms of athlete self-report stuff, because it's, kind of a really opportune time to do that. So we're trying to expand that a little bit in a couple of areas. Beyond that, the broader ideas I'm trying to look at right now is, I think, really just broadly this theme of looking beyond the internal and external dichotomy and trying to understand more about maybe a little bit more complex model of what things help performance, what things hurt performance. I think when we look at the self-report literature, the tough part with that is, especially when you're doing interviews and open-ended stuff, is athletes are going to tell you a lot of things that you can't code as internal or external because they don't fit the definitions that we've developed. And even going beyond kind of our motor behavior bubble of attentional focus literature, traditionally, if we go back all the way to internal, external model presented within sports psychology, it's a much broader concept. And so I think in terms of understanding both performance and learning, I think one of the things I'm hoping to do is try to develop a little bit more understanding. What are other factors or what are other situations that in terms of attentional focus that might help or hurt someone's performance? The other things, still got a little bit more movement variability stuff going on. We've got a study that was halted by COVID, of course, but my the same doctoral student I was telling you about, his dissertation work, we're looking at trying to use an uncontrolled manifold approach in looking at differences in internal and external focus in standing on some balance discs. And so that's just, it's looking interesting so far, but we're about halfway through our data sets. We want to collect the rest of the data before we draw any conclusions there. I mean, so something like that's, again, the function of opportunity, working with a student that has those skills. But the main focus going forward for me really is trying to develop a stronger understanding of how our skilled performers directing their attention, specifically in performance, is my strongest interest. And then figuring out how can we take some of that knowledge and put it into some different experimental paradigms to try to get a more nuanced understanding of when different types of focus might help or hurt somebody.
No, that's great. I think that's really lots of interesting lines of research, and I think there's still lots of mileage here. So this was really great. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for the great discussion, Kevin. To learn more about his work, please check out the links in the show notes. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
I hear the winter cut you quick.